These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? These positions tend to start the same way. White has no immediate tactical options, so he looks for checks and considers how black's replies to them would change the board. Here white's only check is rook moves to e8. Black's only legal reply is king moves to h7. Now white asks the usual questions about the position that then would exist. He traces the lines out from the new position black's king would occupy and sees that it would be aligned with his queen. White's light-squared bishop is available to then play bishop moves to e4, pinning the black queen with protection from the rook. The queen is lost. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has a battery of bishop and queen trained on h2, a square adjacent to white's king. How can he take advantage of this? Answer this question by playing through possible checks and captures in your mind's eye, then methodically evaluating the board as it would look after the replies your opponent might make. Thus we begin by imagining bishop takes at h2, check. King takes bishop would be impossible because black's queen still would bear down on h2, white would have to play his king to h1 or g2. Either move puts his king and queen on the same diagonal. Black thus looks for a pin with his light-squared bishop and finds bishop moves to c6, paralyzing white's queen and winning it next move. White to move. What is the best move? The situation is tense for white. Notice that his queen is pinned. He could try moving his king, but one wants to avoid playing defensive moves too quickly. Better to first consider every offensive option and its results. Here that means not just looking for pins like the inadequate rook moves to e3, but considering every available check and black's possible replies. Since white's queen is pinned, his only check is rook moves to h7, check. The d-file is off limits to black's king because white's queen is there, and the same goes for e6. Thus the king's only flight square is e8. But this lands the king on the same light squared diagonal as black's queen, so you immediately look for a pin with your light squared bishop. Bishop moves to b5 does the trick. Now black can't play queen takes queen because his queen is paralyzed. The best he can do is queen takes bishop, allowing white to play queen takes queen and effectively end the game. White to move. What is the best move? Consider white's checks. He has several with his queen e.g., queen moves to c8, queen moves to f7, or queen moves to b5, but none of them force the king to move. The best is queen moves to b5, which at least doesn't lose the queen, but black meets it with queen moves to d7. So now white looks for checks with other pieces and finds bishop moves to a4, check. This time black can't afford to play queen moves to d7 because it forfeits his queen. He has to move his king to d8 or f8. Either move puts his king and queen on the same dark squared diagonal. Can white take advantage with his dark squared bishop? If black plays king moves to d8, white has bishop moves to g5, pinning the queen with support from the knight on f3. If black plays king moves to f8, white can play that same bishop to the other side of the board with bishop moves to a3, again pinning the queen, this time with backup from the rook on a1. So no matter how black replies to bishop moves to a4, check, his queen gets pinned by a white bishop a move later. White to move. What is the best move? The game is young, but it's never too early to ask about checks and consequences. White sees that he can play bishop moves to g6 and that this would require black to move his king to d8 on a diagonal with his queen. Then white plays his dark squared bishop to a5, pinning the queen. What's wrong with this picture? To pin the queen a piece needs protection, and on a5 white's bishop wouldn't have it. But a pin with an obstacle preventing it is no reason to give up. Keep playing with the idea, in this case by being thorough about considering all of your checks with all of your pieces. Here white has a second option, queen moves to h5, check. This check is different because in addition to pushing the king to d8 it also provides protection for the dark squared bishop once it moves to a5. If black tries pawn from g7 moves to g6, then white plays bishop takes at g6, check, this forces the king over, which works fine since the protection for the pinning place has been installed. Lesson 1, when you are trying to pin the queen, think imaginatively about ways to protect the pinning piece, consider different squares it can use, and whether other pieces might move into position to provide the protection while also inflicting time-consuming checks. Lesson 2, often the most interesting result when you force an enemy king to move is that it steps into alignment with its fellow pieces and creates the makings of a pin. So don't just follow the king as it travels, follow its relationships to the rest of the pieces on the board. White to move. What is the best move? Making use of forced interpositions. That first batch of studies all involved checks that forced the enemy king to move itself into a pin. But a check doesn't always force the enemy king to move. The other two possibilities are that your opponent might capture the threatening piece or interpose something between it and the king. Interpositions, like moves by the king, can lead to pins. Indeed, by assumption an interposition causes an enemy piece to pin itself. You then may be able to take it if you have enough offensive power at your disposal. The importance of examining checks is especially great when the enemy king's range of motion is severely constricted, as is the case for black in the figure to the left. White has just one check to consider, queen moves to e5. Black has no way to capture white's queen and no way to move his king to safety. His only legal reply is to interpose his rook, rook moves to g7, walking into a pin. Of course white will not be taking the rook with his queen, he will throw a cheap attacker at it with pawn from h5 moves to h6. Attack pinned pieces with pawns when you can. The rook is lost. The point is simple. Anytime a check you can inflict will cause your opponent to interpose something between his king and your attacking piece, ask whether you can throw any fresh attackers at the interposed piece. At least for the moment it will be pinned and unable to flee. Black to move. What is the best move? Black is down a piece, how should he proceed? He might, of course, consider any checks he can inflict and whether they lead to tactical opportunities. He has a queen and a rook to examine. Queen moves to h3, check. Queen takes at h2, check. Queen moves to f3, check. And queen moves to e2, check. Can be dismissed quickly, as they all lose the queen with nothing to show for it. Then there is rook moves to c2, check. Which at least is a safe move. Consider what white would do. Playing king moves to h1 or king moves to g1 won't be good for him. Black then looks for his next check and finds that he can end the game with queen takes at h2, checkmate. and white can't move the king to h3 or f3, nor can he capture black's rook. So he would have to interpose something. Bishop moves to e2 wouldn't make sense, since black just plays rook takes bishop, check. White instead would need to play rook moves to d2, using his rook to block the check while protecting it with his queen. The key point to spot is that this interposition, like any other, leaves the guardian pinned. The next step, attack the pinned piece again. Consider every way you can do it. Find queen moves to d1. Now white is in terrible trouble, for his rook is in a cross pin. If he plays rook takes rook, his queen is lost to queen takes queen. Anything else he plays is no better. If he moves the king, rook takes rook wins the rook and then the bishop, to queen takes bishop, a move later. If white plays bishop moves to e2, rook takes rook again wins the rook for black and then the bishop a move later, since it would be pinned. This position is worth some study, as the key moves and their implications are a bit counterintuitive. White to move. What is the best move? Black moved his king out toward the middle of the board, which is hazardous in the middle game for many reasons. It typically becomes a good idea in the end game, but he wasn't quite at that stage yet. One reason is that it is easier to pin things to the king once it is surrounded by accessible lines. Here white senses opportunity but has no immediate way to impose a pin, so he considers his checks and their consequences. Again, there are two pieces to consider, the rook and the queen. Rook moves to c6 loses the rook, and rook moves to f5 loses the rook, and anyway it would allow the king to escape onto the 6th rank. Notice that b4 is off limits. So how about the queen's checks? Queen moves to g5 is of great interest because the 6th rank remains sealed off by the rook. Black's king thus has no flight squares, so black will have to interpose something between the king and white's queen. If he plays rook moves to e5, the rook is lost to queen takes rook, check. And white mates soon. If black instead plays queen moves to d5, black's queen will have walked into a pin. How to exploit it? Again, look for other pieces, besides the white queen imposing the pin, that can be used to take black's queen now that it's stuck. White's only plausible piece for the purpose is the rook, so try rook moves to f5. This way the rook takes over the pin, its services no longer are needed on the 6th rank. Its purpose there was to force black to pin his own queen on the previous move. And notice, incidentally, that rook moves to f5 also unmasks an attack by white's queen on black's rook. The best black can do is play his rook to d7 so that it can recapture when his queen is taken. Now white has rook takes queen, black replies rook takes rook, and white has won a queen for a rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has two checks to examine: rook takes rook, which then loses the rook and amounts to an unhelpful exchange, and queen moves to h3. White's only legal move in reply to queen moves to h3 is queen moves to h2, an interposition. It's hard to see how black could take advantage of it, since the pinned queen is attacked once and protected once. There is no way to bring black's rook into the fray effectively. Don't give up, though. The white queen's move to h2 has greatly limited the king's liberty, so think about another check. Queen moves to f3. How would white respond? The king can't move and black's queen can't be taken, so white would have to interpose either his queen, with queen moves to g2, losing the queen to rook takes queen, or his rook with rook moves to g2. Now the rook would be pinned. This time would black have a way to throw another piece at the pinned target? Yes, with pawn from h4 moves to h3. The rook gets taken by the pawn on the next move. If white plays queen takes at h3, black replies queen takes queen. The moral of this position is that if a first check causes changes but creates no tactical openings, see what new checks are available and assess the position that results as if it were on the board in front of you. Repeat as necessary. White to move. What is the best move? Now a study in caution. You see the obvious pin of black's knight on f6 by white's bishop. It's a relative pin, a theme we discuss later. Black's knight can move legally, but his queen will be lost. Since the knight appears to be paralyzed as a defender, the black pawn on d5 is free for the taking with knight takes at d5. If black replies knight takes knight, white seems able to play bishop takes queen. Not so fast, however. This is a classic trap. When you imagine moving your pieces around, even just to make a capture, ask as a matter of course what lines the moves would open, especially when a piece like white's knight starts out aligned with its king, so that moving it creates a new check for the other side. What checks would be possible for black after white plays bishop takes queen? Just one: bishop moves to b4, check. The white king has no flight squares, so his only reply is to interpose his queen on d2. Black then plays bishop takes queen, winning back the queen and doing it with check, so that after white plays king takes bishop, black still has a move to play king takes bishop back at his end of the board, winning the bishop that took his queen. Black ends up with a piece in return for a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Making use of forced captures. We're looking at ways to create pins where the alignments for them don't yet exist. We have seen how checks can achieve this by forcing an enemy piece to step in front of the king or by forcing the king itself to move. Now let's look at how attacks on an opponent's king can force him to make captures that likewise may result in pins. A vulnerability in black's own position here should jump out at you. He has a loose piece on the same rank as his king, they are poised to be forked by white's rook with rook moves to c7, check. But it's black's turn to move, and before moving to stop the fork think about offense. Black has two checks to consider, rook moves to d2, check. Losing the rook to knight takes rook, and rook takes knight, check. In reply to the latter, white would not be able to interpose anything, and if his king flees he has forfeited his knight for nothing. So the likely response for white would be a capture, king takes rook. Since this moves the king, reassess its position. It would be on the same diagonal as white's rook. This calls for a pin using the light-squared bishop, bishop moves to a6. Now what? It's white's turn to move and his rook has become a paralyzed target, so ask what defenders he might add to it. Remember that white already sacrificed the exchange to get here, so he wants to win back more than the exchange now. White could play pawn from b2 moves to b3. But then black has a pawn of his own to add to the attack with pawn from d6 moves to d5. Black wins the rook. Black also has another option, play bishop takes rook, inviting the recapture pawn from b3 takes bishop, and now black's a pawn and b pawn can be marched forward, and the a pawn soon will promote. You might have noticed from the outset here that black can impose a pin with bishop moves to a6, a relative pin of white's rook to his knight. Since the knight currently is attacked once and protected once, it will be lost if white exposes it to capture a second time by moving the rook. But the pin fails because white can break out of it with check, rook moves to c7, check. Or rook moves to f4, check. This illustrates why absolute pins are so powerful. If a piece is pinned to its king, it can't break out of the pin in this way. Black to move. What is the best move? Black is down the exchange and his queen is in immediate danger. He has no way to guard it. But before withdrawing it to safety he of course looks at his checks. Queen moves to e2, check. Or queen takes queen, check. Either way his queen gets taken, but on tracing the lines in the resulting positions black sees that if the two sides trade queens, the result is to leave white's king and rook on the same light-squared diagonal with nothing between them. Black has an attacker he can use on that axis. He plays bishop moves to b7, pinning and winning white's rook. White to move. What is the best move? When you consider the checks you can give, it's important to be thorough in thinking about all of your pieces and pawns. Here white can check with his g-pawn, pawn from g2 moves to g4, check. Black can't retreat the king to h6 because white's queen attacks the square. He can't interpose anything because there's no room for that. He has no choice but to capture the threatening pawn with rook takes at g4, king takes at g4 is made impossible by white's king. The salient fact on the board as it would then look is that black's rook ends up on the same diagonal as his king. White has a pin with queen moves to f3. The queen takes the rook next move, safe against recapture because of the protection it gets from white's king. Incidentally, there is another interesting way for white to win a rook here. Notice that the black rook on b4 is loose. A loose enemy piece, an exposed enemy king, and a queen at your disposal to attack them, these all are makings of a fork. You need just to look for checking sequences that allow you to maneuver your queen into position. First comes queen moves to f3, check. Forcing king moves to h6. Now another check, queen moves to e3, check. Forcing king moves to g7, if black plays king moves to h5 or pawn from g6 moves to g5, white mates with his queen on g5. Now white has the fork queen moves to c3, picking up the rook next move. Black to move. What is the best move? A knot of pieces like those surrounding white's king can create intricate problems. But before getting buffaloed by the intricacies, try the standard method of considering checks and consequences. Here black has two to ponder. The first is bishop takes at b2, check. Which ends up trading the bishop for a rook after white responds rook takes bishop and black replies pawn from a3 takes rook, check. Black's second idea is to start with pawn from a3 takes at b2, check. In reply to this white can't move his king and can't interpose anything, so he has to capture the pawn with his rook which then is pinned by the bishop on f6. What do you do with a pinned piece? Attack it again. Here the only resource that remains for black is his king, but it's good enough. He plays king moves to a3, and has bishop takes at b2 next move. This wins the rook, more to the point, it leads to mate. White can take the c2 bishop with his f2 rook, but this just forestalls the inevitable. Of course you might as well have seen the idea here by noting the pin of the b2 pawn from the start. You upgrade it to a rook with pawn from a3 takes at b2, then hit the rook with king moves to a3 and bishop takes rook. White to move. What is the best move? Using threats and captures without check. Finally, let's look at a couple of other types of forcing sequences that can lead to pins. In this first example, white has no checks to give, but there is a natural capture to consider in knight takes bishop, particularly since the bishop is guarded just by the king, which will move to d6 on the recapture. Now assess the board as it would then look, asking the standard questions about the king and pieces on its lines. You see that the king's move will cause the knight on d5 to become pinned by the rook on d1, and thus paralyzed, and you can take advantage of this by throwing a pawn at the pinned piece with pawn from e2 moves to e4, winning the knight a move later. The point, examining forcing moves means studying any checks you can give. But it means looking at any captures you can make, too, since replies to them usually are simple enough to predict. This is especially important when you can take a piece guarded only by the enemy king. Any recapture will then require the king to move, and its movement may create the usual nice opportunities for pins and other tactics. White to move. What is the best move? White has an inviting prospect here for a pawn fork. Black's king and rook are a square apart on the same rank, and white can reach them with pawn from g2 moves to g4, check. Naturally, you might as well have found this by just looking for white's checks. True, the pawn has no protection, but it may have value anyway just as a forcing move. If black retreats his king, he loses his rook, so he would instead need to play king takes at g4. Imagine the result and you see that his king and rook would end up on the same light squared diagonal. Time to go to work with the light squared bishop. White plays bishop moves to e6, pinning the rook. He takes it a move later with bishop takes rook, winning the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? Exploiting a pin. Using pawns to attack the pinned piece. Once you've imposed a pin, what can you do with it? Capturing the pinned piece is the most natural possibility and the one we mostly have seen so far. Usually when you threaten an enemy piece, your opponent can choose between moving it or giving it more protection. A pin means the targeted piece can't be moved, so the quality of its protection is the sole determinant of its fate. In the simplest cases, where the pinned piece can be taken for free or where it's worth more than the piece inflicting the pin, the piece doing the pinning on move 1 simply takes the pinned piece on move 2. But often the pinned piece will have protection, or will be supplied with protection right away once the pin appears, and trading it for the pinned piece is not so attractive. In that case, more imagination may be needed to bring the pinned piece down. There are 3 general ideas to grasp. The option of first resort typically is to go after the target with a pawn. Where this is possible, it makes no difference how much protection the pinned piece enjoys, because trading it for a pawn always will be favorable to you. Second, if none of your pawns are available for the purpose, you may be able to pile up on the pinned piece with more of your pieces. Such positions become a race to see who can surround the pinned piece with more firepower. Your task is get more pieces to the scene of the pin than the enemy can rally. Third, there are some other useful tools to consider. You may be able to drive defenders away from the pinned piece, especially if one of the defenders is the enemy king, and then there is the possibility of a cross pin. You may be able to pin the pinned piece a second time in another direction. This chapter will examine all of those options, starting here with the use of pawns to bring down the pin target. In a perfect world, the position looks like the one to the left. White scans the lines leading away from black's king and sees that the knight on d5 is ready to be pinned on the 5th rank. It's a horizontal pin, and white has a rook at the ready for it. He plays 1. Rook moves to a5 and now the knight is paralyzed. But he won't be able to play rook takes knight because black's next move is pawn from c7 moves to c6, protecting the knight. Since taking the pinned piece with the pinning piece isn't practical, white looks for other ways to attack the knight. A pawn is best. White has 2. Pawn from c2 moves to c4, and now the black's knight protection is no consolation. He loses the piece, and then trades pawns. White to move. What is the best move? A scan of the black king's lines turns up an obvious candidate for a pin in the knight on e4. White plays the simple one. Rook moves to e1. Now what? Black rushes a pawn to the knight's defense with pawn from d7 moves to d5, which rules out rook takes knight for white on the next move. So white resorts to a pawn, 2 pawn from f2 moves to f3, winning the knight a move later. The protection a pinned piece enjoys becomes meaningless when it is attacked by a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? The current principle in a diagonal rather than vertical setting, just for the sake of pattern reinforcement. Black's knight and king on the same diagonal should jump out at you. What also should jump out are the white pawns that will be able to attack the knight once it is pinned. White starts with 1. Bishop moves to b3, black backs up the knight with pawn from c7 moves to c6, which prevents it from being taken by white's bishop, so white plays 2. Pawn from e3 moves to e4, and the knight is lost. White to move. What is the best move? White scans the lines leading to black's king and sees that the knight on c6 is ready to be pinned. He looks for a resource he can use on the knight's diagonal and finds queen moves to a4. This move also has the virtue of attacking black's bishop on a6, which is loose. The bishop both moves to safety and provides protection for the knight with bishop moves to b7, so white won't be playing queen takes knight. But now comes the pawn push, pawn from d4 moves to d5, and the paralyzed knight is lost irrespective of how much protection it has. This pattern, a pawn in the middle of the board marching forward to take a piece pinned to its king on the enemy's third rank, is common enough to be worth a moment's study. White to move. What is the best move? This time white already has black's bishop pinned on the e-file. How should he take advantage of this? The bishop is protected by a pawn, so rook takes bishop is out. The natural idea is to push a pawn toward the pinned piece with pawn from d4 moves to d5. Of course the pawn needs to be secure against capture, so study the squares on the pawn's road. Here black would be able to respond to the pawn thrust with queen takes at d5, but then white would play queen takes queen, and would black have a reply? No, because the bishop is pinned and would be unable to recapture. So black is better off succumbing to pawn from d5 takes bishop. The point is that when you are pushing a pawn toward a pinned target, you want to think carefully about whether it is safe on each of the squares it needs, keeping in mind that each square may be guarded by multiple attackers and defenders, but also that the pinned piece itself will pose no threat. White to move. What is the best move? White has black's bishop pinned, this time on the d-file. Again the bishop is protected, indeed, it is protected twice. So white's best bet is to attack the bishop with a pawn, as this would make the bishop's protection irrelevant. White has a pawn ready to go on c4. The best way to advance a pawn is with threats that force the enemy to waste moves getting his pieces out of the way. Here the pawn can move to c5 with a threat to black's knight. After the knight moves, the pawn goes to c6 and takes the bishop a move later. Or black moves his king after white's pawn from c4 moves to c5, inviting white to take the knight on b6 instead. There's one loose end, the knot of pieces on pawn from e4 moves to e5 and pawn from f4 moves to f5. Black's e5 pawn attacks white's bishop, and white's g4 pawn attacks black's knight. It would be a simple matter for white to exchange pieces here with black, but should it be done before or after the pawn push toward the pinned bishop? Answer: before. It simplifies the rest of your plans afterwards, and it reduces the number of pieces on the board, which magnifies the edge you are about to obtain. Black to move. What is the best move? Black checked White's king by moving his bishop to a6, and White replied by interposing his bishop on d3. We know one way to handle a bishop on the same diagonal as its king in this setting: trade it for another piece. Thus Black plays rook takes bishop, White replies rook takes rook, and now White's rook is pinned, a suitable target. The next question is how to attack it. Bishop takes rook would make the whole sequence a wash. After White recaptures, Black needs to summon more force against the rook. He can throw another rook of his own at it with rook moves to d8, to which White would reply rook moves to d1, and the pinned rook still would be guarded as many times as it's attacked. What Black really needs is a pawn on a file adjacent to the rook that can be used to go after it. The obvious candidate is the pawn on e6, but it's 2 moves away from the pinned rook. What to do? Answer: march the pawn forward. Black plays pawn from e6 moves to e5, and there is nothing White can do to prevent Black from playing pawn from e5 moves to e4 on the next move, and then pawn from e4 takes rook a move later. White can play pawn from g2 moves to g3, threatening Black's bishop, but then the bishop just retreats and the plight of the pinned rook is unchanged. The reason Black's pawn is free to march forward is that the few pieces White could use to stop it are committed to their positions. White's king can't move because it is protecting the pinned rook, and anyway Black has d2 and e3 sealed off with his bishop. Nor can White's knight or rook be maneuvered into better positions in time to stop the pawn's progress. This is what sometimes happens once a pin is imposed. It requires your opponent to freeze his pieces into positions that help protect the pinned piece. His immobility makes it easier for you to make offensive moves with your other pieces. Sometimes the time it takes to move your pawn will give the enemy a chance to rearrange his pieces. That is why it usually is best if the pawn makes threats on its way up the board that require time-consuming replies. But as this position shows, that isn't always necessary. Black to move. What is the best move? Here Black starts with a pin already in place on White's f3 knight. The knight is well guarded, and one of its guards is a pawn, so Black has no obvious way to capture it. As usual, though, the goal is to go after the knight with a pawn, and as we saw in the previous position, pawns sometimes can march up the board by threatening enemy pieces as they go. Here Black experiments with a threatening push. Pawn from h7 moves to h6. White has to move his queen, but ask where. Sometimes that question will be easy to answer, as in cases like this where the queen's range of motion is limited. Here it has to go to h4 or else be lost on the spot. Now what does Black do? Remember the objective: to march a pawn up the board. Black can play pawn from g7 moves to g5, again threatening white's queen. The queen either takes black's pawn on h6 or moves to h3. Either way, black completes the exercise with pawn from g5 moves to g4, at last attacking the pinned white knight and winning it a move later. A few lessons to take away from this study. First and generally, when you have pinned an enemy piece, do not give up lightly on the hope of throwing a pawn at it. Pawns are frightening to larger pieces, and this can give them unexpected mobility. Second, a pawn in its starting position is somewhat surprisingly only 2 moves from threatening a piece on the enemy's third rank. Third, the position shows how pawns sometimes can march up the board together, with one issuing a threat and then providing protection for the other as it too advances. White to move. What is the best move? White sees the tempting pattern of queen in front of king on the e-file. He instinctively thinks of the classic rook-pin rook moves to e1. But on consideration of the likely reply, he sees that black has an interposition to play, knight moves to e4, blocking white from playing rook takes queen. Is white dissuaded? No, because a piece that defends by interposing itself often becomes pinned itself, whether to the king or queen as happens here. The knight would be paralyzed upon its arrival at e4, at least momentarily, because if it moves it exposes the queen to attack. So white goes after the knight with a pawn from f2 moves to f3. He has pawn from f3 takes knight next move. White to move. What is the best move? Now notice a side consequence of pawn from e5 moves to e6, the path between the two queens has been opened as well. But if black plays queen takes queen, white recaptures knight takes queen and the bishop at d7 remains pinned. White takes it next turn. Notice, too, the importance of the move order. After black's queen takes queen, white must not play rook takes bishop, check. This might look tempting, since the priority of check suggests that after black fends off the attack on his king, white still will have time to take black's queen. But black fends off the check precisely by playing his queen back to g7. White takes it with his rook, but loses the exchange once black recaptures king takes rook. Once again there are a few lessons to observe here. The first is the same as in the previous position: don't give up lightly on the possibility of attacking a pinned piece with a pawn. Second, this position shows how pawns whose paths are blocked may be able to advance if the blockers are lured out of the way by other attacks you launch. Third, when you are pushing pawns, be mindful of the lines and especially the diagonals they open and close as they move forward. This really is an application of the principles studied in the section on discovered attacks. In effect, the pawn here unmasks a discovered attack by moving to e6, and at the same time it exposes its own queen to attack.